Welcome to the February 28th session of the Phoenix Congress, where we are writing a blueprint for a better America. This legislative package will end poverty with universal basic income, end mass incarceration with major criminal justice reform, and end the endless wars by bringing our troops home and reducing our military budget. Today's session is the 13th of 21 public hearings on the 2022 legislative package, and we will review sections 331 to 333 relative to economic sanctions and the war in Yemen. These sessions will alternate between Mondays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern through March 28th. For those following along at home, you can find a link to the legislative package in the description below or at bit.ly/B, lowercase Dropbox. If you have questions about today's sections, you can submit them in the chat. And if you'd like to offer questions or other testimony from future hearings, please use the link in the description below. Before starting, I'd like to invite you to join us in reciting the preamble to the Constitution of the United States to remind us of our duties as Americans and set the intention for what we are trying to do today. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. With that, I'd like to welcome the delegate from North Carolina's 9th District to continue his testimony on the blueprint for a better America.
Thank you, Mixed Chair. For the record, my name is Brian. I'm an organizer with the American Union and a Phoenix Congress delegate in good standing, representing North Carolina's 9th District. And today we're going to start on subtitle B, Improving America's Moral Standing in the World, which I guess sort of leads the question, what is America's moral standing in the world? How does the rest of the world see us? And it's easy for us as Americans to think back to World War II as us being kind of the heroes and saving the world kind of thing. In the decades and decades since, we've gotten involved in a number of other foreign wars. Our international relationships have varied, and so where are we today? Well, the reason for this section is because there are opportunities where our moral standing is not very good and needs improvement. And today we're going to talk about our use of economic sanctions and our support for the Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen. So Section 331 would restrict the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations. What are economic sanctions? Essentially, this is sort of cutting people off from the marketplace and saying that you can't buy or sell with this country. In a presentation on sanctions last fall, Margaret Flowers defined them as unilateral coercive economic measures. And so I think it's important to emphasize that word unilateral, right? If I say if the IRS is going to freeze your bank account or something like that, you can take them to court. You have some sort of appeal process. And when we talked about civil asset forfeiture, if you get stopped on the side of the road and somebody takes the law enforcement takes all your money, they give you a receipt and you can try and win it back. The sanctions that we put on other countries are unilateral. There's no appeal. There's no due process. This is the United States saying, sorry, we're going to cut you off from world markets. And so, because when they're targeted against individuals, sanctions are targeted against individuals, and that's one thing. But when they are targeted against an entire country, they are a form of collective punishment. And for civilians, economic violence can be even more deadly than military force. If you look at North Korea, for example, the people there are more malnourished. They're physically shorter than their relations in South Korea as a result of being cut off from world markets. Our US sanctions against places like Iran, we're seeing this now with Russia. They're devaluing their currency, which leads to inflation and impacts family budgets across a nation. And economic sanctions are sort of like a reverse universal basic income. Those with the least get hurt the most. According to the website sanctionskill.org, the United States is currently imposing sanctions on Afghanistan, Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Burundi, Central African Republic, the People's Republic of China, Comoros, Crimea region of Ukraine, Cuba, Cyprus, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Moldova, Montenegro, Myanmar, Nicaragua, North Korea, Palestinian territories, Russia, Rwanda, Serbia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Venezuela, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. Some 40 countries representing a huge part of the world's population are being hurt and hit by our economic sanctions. Even if we don't actually sanction a country, before we put sanctions on Venezuela, for example, they were designated a national security threat. And when you do that, it puts international businesses on notice that this country could be next. Like, this is a country you probably don't want to do business with. You could imagine, if you've read in the newspaper that you were being investigated for something, that maybe your employer might not want to be associated with you anymore. And so we do that to other countries around the world. In the case of Venezuela, the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. released a report in 2019 looking at the harm that our sanctions there have caused, and concluded that more than 40,000 civilian deaths could be attributed to our sanctions against that country. One of the things that we do is, Venezuela, for example, is an oil-rich country, and by blocking them from selling their oil to U.S. companies, we disrupt the income of the nation and make it that much harder for the people in the country to meet their basic needs, to buy the things that they need on the world market. A couple other quick examples. We complain about the gridlock in Congress, but some of the things that they are still getting done is working together to put sanctions on countries like Nicaragua. Last year on November 1st, the Senate passed S 1064, the Reinforcing Nicaragua's Adherence to Conditions for Electoral Reform Act of 2021. And you're probably thinking, wait, what does that mean? Are we trying to tell Nicaragua how they should run their elections? And the answer is yes. We're punishing the country if we don't like the way that their elections are run. The Senate passed that on November 1st, and on November 3rd, the House did too. And you're probably thinking, wait, 2 days, was that really enough time for Congress to give it due deliberation and be sure what they're doing? No, it just flew right through, and a week later it was on the president's desk and signed into law. Cuba, we've had a blockade, we've had sanctions against Cuba since John F. Kennedy was president, for 60 years. Like, 5 out of 6 people that live in Cuba now weren't even alive when this started. And yet we continue to restrict trade with the entire nation of Cuba. And this does not make us look good to the rest of the world. Since 1992, the United Nations they've introduced resolutions recognizing the quote, necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Last June, for the 29th time in a row, the United Nations adopted this resolution, by a vote of 184 in favor, 2 against. We don't look very good to the rest of the world when we throw our economic weight around and use it to push around small countries like this. Mexico last summer, Cuba had protests. Mexico wanted to send supplies, and they couldn't get any commercial carrier to send humanitarian assistance because then that commercial carrier could be penalized by the United States. They had to use a naval vessel to bring humanitarian supplies to Cuba. And so Section 331 of the Blueprint for a Better America will restrict the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit on this one. So I'm going to share my screen and we can look at the legislation and the law itself. On the left-hand side, we've got the Section 331, and on the right is the section of U.S. code that is being amended. And so these are economic sanctions that are relating to Iran. And right now we have sanctions prohibiting on imports and prohibiting exports. So basically no good or service of Iranian origin can be imported into the United States or exported. Sometimes I hire people on Upwork. It's a popular service for people providing, you can hire freelancers and things like that. I can't hire anyone from Iran. I can't be employed by anyone from Iran because of this section of law. And so subsection A would repeal both of those, and as well as the regulatory authority that would allow the president to create an exemption for the paragraphs that are being deleted. That's subsection A of section 331. After that, we get into the rest of the bill amends Chapter 79 of Title 22. And these are the sections that deal with trade sanctions. And so subsection B creates a new definition. It adds a new definition of unilateral economic sanction. And that would mean any prohibition, restriction, or condition on non-specific imports or exports with respect to a foreign country or foreign entity that is imposed by the United States. And then there are exemptions for if we're part of a multilateral regime and we're doing this as a group effort, or it's part of a mandatory decision by the United Nations. Subsection C, we're going to go ahead and start putting these restrictions into place. Where we already have restrictions that are supposed to stop the United States from imposing agricultural sanctions or medical sanctions, we would add unilateral economic sanctions to those provisions as well. It would also require that when any sanction is proposed, that it describe a current action by the foreign country or foreign entity to make sure that countries aren't being penalized for things that previous generations have done. And this would also terminate any unilateral sanctions that are in place that are in effect as of October 30th, 2022. There are exemptions in the current law for state sponsors of international terrorism, and those exemptions do stay in place. I'm sorry, the provisions for the state sponsors of international terrorism, those exemptions go away, and there's the same restriction on unilateral economic sanctions for any country. 7207 is relates to prohibition on United States assistance and financing. And this stops and discourages businesses from trading with various countries. And unless it's part of a United Nations declaration or part of some sort of international coalition, we should keep our thumb off the scales in the international marketplace when it comes to civilian populations. And the last subsection of this here on the left, this would amend Section 208 of Title 22 to be very clear that this chapter shall be construed to nullify the existing prohibitions and blockade of Cuba. And so after more than six decades, we can fix that policy. And our neighbor to the south, we can once again be trying to improve our relationships with our neighbors. So, well, with that, Mixed Chair, I believe that concludes my testimony on Section 331.
Thank you. We have a couple folks in the chat. They're not speaking English, so I'm so sorry if you have if you're asking a question and I can't read it. But I do have a question. So while I agree with you generally that the United States does not have strong moral ground to stand on, oftentimes or maybe not even oftentimes, but sometimes economic sanctions are used as a way to sort of almost punish another country, or if a country is doing something that the world generally sees as negative, whether it is harming their own civilians or harming people in another country. If economic sanctions are not going to are not a humane way to try to address those problems, what other avenues do we have to try to affect how those nation states are acting?
I think part of it probably depends on the specifics when you say acting, whether it's the way that they're acting in their own country. If they're just have the audacity to elect leadership that we don't approve of, well, sorry, it's not our country. We don't get to tell other countries how they run their elections and who they are, and we don't get to decide who they elect as their leaders. You talked about how economic sanctions could be effective, but when you do that, you're acknowledging that they're a collective punishment, that you're punishing the entire country for something that the entire country isn't doing, but you're punishing everyone, and collective punishments are prohibited under the United Nations Charter. Did that answer your question, or were you looking? If you can give me more of a specific example?
Yeah. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing on this stance of ending economic sanctions, or that sanctions are harmful. I don't think that they are helpful. I agree with you. I think that they are often a net negative. But when we see, for example, a very recent modern example is Russia invading Ukraine, this is something that the world at large is mostly against, but many countries, including the United States, are considering economic sanctions against Russia, which I personally believe would be more hurtful than helpful. I don't think that's going to do much to affect the invasion, but it will negatively affect the innocent people of Russia, and many innocent Russians. But I'm wondering, how then should we approach those kinds of instances, and not just the United States, but countries in general with international relations, when we see behavior like this that is just kind of generally denounced worldwide, that is hurting many people? What might be some other avenues that we could use to try to address those situations?
Well, So I guess first, to talk about Russia, right, is we are using targeted sanctions. We're not cutting off the entire nation, right? So targeted sanctions would not be restricted by this section. It only deals with unilateral nationwide sanctions. Second thing is that there's also exemptions in there for if you're part of a multilateral coalition or part of a UN. It's part of a UN thing. The restriction here in Section 331 is about the United States unilaterally saying we're going to punish this entire country. So if it's part of a larger coalition, without endorsing it, I would say that it wouldn't be prohibited under Section 331.
Thanks. And we do have another question here. What about Cuban cigars? Are they illegal?
Yes, they are. You're not allowed to import anything from Cuba. You're not allowed to anything that has passed through Cuba. It's a pretty restrictive blockade on Cuba. Apparently, there was a narrow exemption for personal use that President Obama created, and then it only lasted about 4 years, and President Trump removed the exemption. So, yes, if you have a Cuban cigar, you are in violation of United States law.
Thank you. Okay. Seeing no further questions, Section 331 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. You may proceed to Section 332.
All right. Thank you, Mixed Chair. Section under 332, we're going to talk about suspension of arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. And so you could say these are targeted sanctions to say that these type of materials will not be sold to the nation of Saudi Arabia. The language in Section 331 comes from S-398, the Saudi Arabia Accountability in Yemen Act of 2019, which was introduced by Senator Menendez of New Jersey. And what it does is it puts a 5-year suspension of arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. It's not a permanent ban. And like we talked about with Cuba that we've had for decades and decades, this ban can also be lifted after a 180-day ceasefire, as long as Saudi Arabia is also demonstrating through sincere words and actions that they are working towards a peaceful resolution, and that they also lift the blockade that they have around Yemen. Yeah, I guess so. Let me talk a little more about what the specifics are, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the situation with Yemen. And so on the effective date of this section, which should be October 30th of this year, any license for these military weapons would become to any permission granted to sell these weapons to Saudi Arabia. That permission would be revoked. No more licenses would be issued. There would be an exemption for ground-based missile defenses. And in a few weeks, we're going to talk more about the value-added tax that's included in the Blueprint for a Better America, which has which exempts all exports with the exception of arms sales would be subject to the value-added tax. Not really relevant to this, but all right. So according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is one of the premier think tanks for tracking arms sales, Saudi Arabia was the world's largest arms importer from 2015 to 2019. They buy an awful lot of weapons, and 73% of it came from the United States. Donald Trump was proud of these things because they create jobs, right? That's the claim. And obviously there's some truth. It's a non-zero amount of jobs. A 2018 report by the Center for International Policy, they looked into this and found that there could be as many as 40,000 jobs that were supported worldwide by all these arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So again, it's a non-zero amount, but in a labor force of 160 million people in this country, it's a few hundredths of 1%. Now, so the reason that they're fighting, the Saudi coalition is fighting in Yemen is over a civil war where the Houthis and are backing the Houthis are control most of the country. Including the capital, they have some support from Iran, and Saudi Arabia is allied against them, has conducted many, has destroyed their economy, has blockaded their port cities, so to make it near impossible for food and other things to get into the country. They have destroyed the Yemenis economy. It's a country of about 30 million people, and when buildings are destroyed, there's jobs are destroyed, there's no money circulating, and if there isn't anything to buy. It's caused a huge humanitarian crisis, one of the greatest humanitarian crises on the planet. A few years ago, there was a big cholera epidemic that swept through the country. The bombs, though, that we're dealing with today, the bombs that are being dropped on the country are 73% of them are American made. In August of 2018, they dropped a laser guided bomb onto a school bus. There's a school bus with about 40 preteen boys, and that bomb was built by Lockheed Martin right here in America. And the following month, Mike Pompeo was the Secretary of State at the time. He certified that Saudi Arabia was making good faith efforts to avoid civilian deaths from airstrikes. And when you're blowing up school buses full of children, I'm not persuaded that that's true. And so by ending these arms sales, it may cost some non-zero amount of jobs. The war machine is humming along at a pretty good clip. So it seems like even if these arms sales stop, there's still going to be, these people aren't going to all lose jobs. But even if they did, that's why this legislative package includes universal basic income, to ensure that no American family can fall into poverty. And so if we're going to put these people out of work so they don't have to make the bombs that blow up children, there'll still be a safety floor underneath them. As we're in the news, we're seeing video of Ukrainians, hunkering in bomb shelters, and that's it's got to be a frightening, traumatic experience for families. But the people in Yemen have it worse because they're having to watch their children starve. Since the war has begun, we're in our 7th year now. The UN estimates about 250,000 civilians have died, mostly children. Like thousands, tens of thousands of children starving. And, as a parent, my kids have plenty to eat, sometimes too much. There's always snacks and things like that. And what would it be like to just not have enough to feed your kids, not just for one day, but for weeks and weeks, and just watch them shrivel away? The New York Times ran a series of photographs of these emancipated, malnourished children in Yemen. And I was going to show some, but I decided against it. This is a humanitarian crisis. And in October 2018, I joined the hunger strike for Yemen to try and call attention to this crisis. And after 18 days, I couldn't go I wasn't feeling well enough to continue. But for so many people in this country, they don't necessarily have the choice to just start eating again. There's just nothing available. And there's been an annual fast for Yemen in April. And like the fact that this has to be an annual thing, that we have to draw attention to the fact that there's so much suffering going on there, it's the point of the Blueprint for a Better America is to end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. And this war in Yemen has been going on for far too long. Ending the endless wars includes this one. We should stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia and enabling their war in Yemen. Yemen can't wait. It's been true for years, and it's just as true today. Next Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for Section 332. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes. How much of a difference do you think this will make in this specific targeted sanction in terms of the actions Saudi Arabia is taking against Yemen?
We sell 73% of their bombs to them. In addition, as we'll talk about in the next section 333, we also provide logistical support for their war. And so when we stop doing that, it will force them to dramatically de-escalate and hopefully bring them to the bargaining table to work out a peaceful resolution to this war.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, or hang on, I have one coming through right now. Has Congress done this sanction before? Did Trump veto it? What happened with that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Congress has passed on several occasions. Bernie Sanders had, I think it was Senate Resolution 7 that would have blocked these arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and it passed easily in the House and the Senate, only to be vetoed by President Trump. This is an issue that Congress is aware of, but we haven't been able to get actual legislation signed into law. And so by including it as part of this larger package, we can actually take the actions needed to help rebuild our moral standing in the world.
Thank you. All right, seeing no further questions, Section 332 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. You may proceed to Section 333.
All right, thank you, Mixed Chair. Section 333 continues by adding a prohibition on military support, or military participation against the Houthis. This section comes from an amendment that was offered by Representative Adam Smith of Washington to the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. The House adopted it, 240 to 85, but the Senate didn't. And so it's still possible that we can be logistically supporting the Saudis' military campaign. So this would be a 5-year ban on supporting the specific war against Yemen. No more giving them intelligence information for doing their offensive strikes. No more logistical support, maintenance, anything like that for their bombing campaign. Unless there's an exemption for if there's an imminent threat, or if the president has specific authorization from Congress. In that case, then there would be permission to act. But in general, no, stop supporting this military campaign. It's been going on now for 7 years. And according to the United Nations, January was one of the worst months for civilian casualties. On January 21st, the Saudi coalition, they bombed a detention facility, which was full of migrants. And the report said, quote, the airstrikes reportedly killed 91 detainees and injured 226, becoming the worst civilian casualty incident in Yemen in 3 years. I haven't been following things in Ukraine super closely, but I feel like I haven't heard of anything killing 91 civilians in one shot over there. And yet we are participating in that sort of bombing campaign in Yemen by offering logistical and informational support to the Saudi coalition. You know, it took a real big commitment. It takes a really sincere effort to reduce Yemen to a nation to such a state of extreme poverty. And we're a willing participant in that. And it's wrong. We should do better as America. We should be a beacon of liberty and hope, not conspiring to oppress and starve people. The United Nations Special Envoy, Hans Grunberg, he reported to the Security Council last month. This was 2 weeks before the detention facility got bombed. He reported that there's going to be no long-term solution that could be found on the battlefield. And he said, quote, "Genuine political will, responsible leadership, and adherence to the interest of the entire population is needed." Genuine political will. It's got to come from somewhere. It's not coming from Saudi Arabia, and it's not coming from Congress. So let it come from the American people. Let us come together and say, look, end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars in 2022. We can say, this is wrong. This has to stop. And we don't want to be a willing participant in the war on Yemen any longer. That, Next Chair, I think that concludes my testimony on Section 333.
Thank you. Let's take a look here. I don't appear, there aren't any questions. So Section 333 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. I'd like to thank the delegate for his testimony.
Thank you, Mixed Chair. I wrote that's quite the ambitious name for a subcommittee. I kind of like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's certainly a lot to it. It's kind of a heavy topic, but
yeah,
right.
we'll talk more about it on Thursday, I think.
For sure, absolutely. Yes, and just glad to see you, DJ Elf, back in the comments again. Yes, Brian is fantastic. All right, the next session of the Phoenix Congress will be held on Thursday, March 3rd at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. We will review sections 334 to 335 relative to the purchase of unethical weapons and the closing of Guantanamo Bay military prison. This hearing is adjourned.